Dog attacked the home nurse. The hidden camera showed why. Margaret Sullivan had lived in the same two-story colonial house in Riverside, Connecticut, for 43 years. She'd raised 3 children there, buried a husband, and watched the neighborhood transform from young families with tricycles and driveways to a mixture of retirees and new professionals who barely waved hello. At 78 years old, Margaret wasn't ready to leave her home, despite what her daughter Karen kept suggesting every other phone call. "Mom, you can't keep living alone," Karen would say from her apartment in Boston, her voice tight with worry that always made Margaret's jaw clench. "What if you fall? What if something happens?" Margaret would grip the phone tighter, looking around her living room with its familiar worn spots on the carpet. The reading chair by the window where morning light pooled just right, the kitchen where she still made her coffee exactly the way she liked it. "I'm fine, Karen. I have Max. He takes care of me." Max was Margaret's 8-year-old German Shepherd, a beautiful dog with intelligent brown eyes and a thick coat that she brushed every evening while watching Jeopardy! He'd been a gift from her late husband Robert 3 years before the cancer took him. Robert had known, somehow, that Margaret would need company. Max wasn't just a pet. He was family, routine, purpose. He needed walking, feeding, brushing. He kept her on schedule, kept her needed. But 6 months ago, Margaret had a stroke. A minor one, the doctors said, like there was such a thing as a minor stroke. She'd been watering her tomato plants when the left side of her body just stopped responding, and she'd crumpled onto the grass with the hose still running. Max had barked and barked until Mrs. Chun from next door came over to investigate. The hospital stay was 3 weeks. The recovery was ongoing. Margaret's left arm still didn't quite cooperate, hanging useless at her side most days. Her leg worked better, but she walked with a cane now, shuffling more than striding. The independence she'd fiercely protected was slipping through her fingers like sand. Karen had flown in during the hospital stay, her face pinched with that expression that made Margaret feel like a burden. They'd had the conversation Margaret had been dreading. "We need to talk about care options, Mom. I'm going home." "Yes, but you'll need help. In-home care. A nurse who can. I don't need a stranger in my house." "Mom." Karen's voice had that edge to it, the one that said she was running out of patience. "You can barely dress yourself. How are you going to manage?" The truth was, Margaret didn't know. But the thought of some stranger touching her things, reorganizing her kitchen, pitying her, it made her want to scream. Still, she wasn't stupid. She knew she needed help, at least temporarily. So she'd agreed, but only to home visits, not a live-in situation. A nurse would come 3 times a week to help with bathing, check her medications, make sure she wasn't dying. That's how Brenda Morrison entered their lives. Brenda was 42, divorced, with bleached blonde hair that showed dark roots and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She worked for Riverside Home Health Services and came with references that Karen had checked thoroughly. On paper, Brenda was perfect, 15 years of experience, CPR certified, glowing reviews from previous clients. "You must be Margaret," Brenda had said on that first visit, her voice sugary sweet as she stood on the front porch with her medical bag. "I'm so looking forward to helping you get back on your feet." Max had growled. It was a low rumble in his chest, his ears flattening as he positioned himself between Margaret and the door. Margaret had been surprised. Max was generally friendly with visitors, curious rather than aggressive. "Max, it's okay," Margaret had said, tugging gently on his collar. "She's here to help." But Max hadn't budged, his eyes locked on Brenda with an intensity that made even Margaret uncomfortable. Brenda had laughed, but it sounded forced. "Not a fan of strangers, huh? That's okay. We'll be friends soon enough." That first visit had gone smoothly enough. Brenda had helped Margaret with a bath, checked her blood pressure, organized her medications into a weekly pill organizer with cheerful labels. She'd chatted about her own life, her ex-husband who hadn't appreciated her, her apartment in the cheaper part of town, how hard it was to make ends meet on a nurse's salary. Margaret had listened politely, but something felt off. Maybe it was the way Brenda's eyes roamed around the house, cataloging things, or the way she held Margaret's arm just a bit too tightly when helping her stand. Or maybe it was just Max, who refused to leave Margaret's side the entire visit, his body tense and alert. "Your dog doesn't like me much," Brenda had observed, her smile tight. "He's just protective," Margaret had replied. "He'll warm up to you." But Max didn't warm up. If anything, his distrust intensified. By the third visit, Max would growl the moment Brenda's car pulled into the driveway. He'd position himself at the door, hackles raised, a low warning rumble constant in his throat. Margaret would have to physically hold his collar to let Brenda inside. "You really should crate that dog when I'm here," Brenda said one afternoon, irritation cracking through a usually sweet tone. "I can't work properly with him staring at me like that." "He's fine," Margaret insisted, though her grip on Max's collar was white-knuckled. "He's never bitten anyone." "There's always a first time," Brenda muttered, but she'd let it drop. Karen called that evening, as she did every Monday and Thursday. "How's it going with the nurse?" Karen asked. Margaret hesitated. What could she say? That Max didn't like Brenda? That there was something about the woman that made her uncomfortable, though she couldn't pinpoint what? It sounded paranoid, foolish. "Fine," Margaret said finally. "She's very efficient." "Good. I was worried you'd be stubborn about it." "I'm not stubborn. I'm independent." "Right." Karen's tone said she didn't see much difference between the two. "Listen, Mom, I've been thinking. Maybe I should install one of those camera systems. So I can check in on you. Make sure you're okay." Margaret's stomach tightened. "You want to spy on me?" "It's not spying, it's safety. What if you fall and can't get to the phone? I could see and call for help. I have a medical alert button." Margaret gestured to the ugly plastic device hanging around her neck that she hated wearing. "Mom, please. It would make me feel better. I worry about you all the time." The guilt trip landed perfectly, as Karen probably knew it would. Margaret sighed, defeated. "Fine, but only in the common areas. Not my bedroom." "Of course not. I'll order one tonight. They're really easy to install." 3 days later, a package arrived. Karen had opted for a system with cameras that looked like small black domes, barely noticeable, mounted in corners. She'd sent 4 of them, one for the living room, one for the kitchen, one for the hallway, and one for the back door. They connected to Wi-Fi and streamed to an app on Karen's phone. "I'll be able to check in anytime," Karen explained over the phone as Margaret fumbled with the instruction manual. "And it records, so if something happens, we'll have footage." Margaret didn't love the idea of being watched, but she had to admit there was something comforting about it, too. At least if she fell, someone would know. She didn't mention the cameras to Brenda. It didn't seem necessary. The incident happened on a Thursday afternoon in late September. Margaret had been feeling particularly weak that day, her left side barely responding. She'd struggled through her morning routine, nearly falling twice getting dressed. When Brenda arrived at 2 p.m., Margaret was exhausted and grateful for the help. "Rough day?" Brenda asked, her smile sympathetic as she helped Margaret out of her chair. "Just tired," Margaret admitted. "Well, let's get you cleaned up and feeling better." Max, as usual, was a shadow at Margaret's side, his eyes never leaving Brenda. They made it halfway through the bath routine when Margaret's cell phone rang from the bedroom. It was probably Karen, checking in. "I should get that," Margaret said. "You're in no condition to be rushing around," Brenda said firmly. "I'll grab it for you." Brenda disappeared into the bedroom, and that's when things got weird. Max, who'd been sitting tensely in the bathroom doorway, suddenly bolted after her. Margaret heard a crash, then Brenda's voice, sharp and angry in a way Margaret had never heard before. "Get away from me, you stupid mutt." Then Max started barking. Not his usual alert bark, but something more desperate, more urgent. Margaret struggled to pull herself up from the bath chair, her heart pounding. "Max? Brenda?" More crashing sounds. Something heavy hitting the floor. "Max, no." That was Brenda, but she sounded panicked now, not angry. Margaret managed to shuffle to the bathroom door, gripping her walker. What she saw in the bedroom made her blood run cold. Max had Brenda's arm in his mouth, not biting down hard enough to break skin for what Margaret could see, but gripping it firmly. Brenda was on the floor, Margaret's jewelry box open beside her, its contents scattered across the carpet. Gold chains, pearl earrings, her grandmother's antique brooch, all tumbling out where Brenda had clearly been rifling through them. Margaret's phone was on the floor too, forgotten. "Let go." Brenda was yelling, trying to pull her arm free. "Let go, you crazy dog." But Max held firm, growling, his eyes locked on Brenda with an intensity that was almost human in its anger. "Max, release," Margaret said quietly. Max obeyed immediately, letting go of Brenda's arm and backing up to stand protectively in front of Margaret. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to keep receiving amazing stories like this one. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss an update. Brenda scrambled to her feet, her face flushed red. Whether from embarrassment or anger, Margaret couldn't tell. "That dog attacked me," Brenda shrieked, holding her arm even though there were no visible marks. "I was just looking for your phone, and he came out of nowhere and attacked me." Margaret looked at the jewelry box, at the pieces scattered on the floor in a very deliberate pattern, looked at Brenda's guilty face, looked at Max, sitting calmly now, but still alert, still watching Brenda with those knowing eyes. "Get out," Margaret said quietly. "What? Get out of my house. Your dog attacked me. I could sue you. I could have him put down." Something fierce and protective rose in Margaret's chest. She straightened as much as she could, gripping her walker, and spoke in a voice that reminded her of the mother she'd been 40 years ago, dealing with a teenager caught in a lie. "My dog stopped you from robbing me. There's a difference. Now get out before I call the police." Brenda's face cycled through several emotions: anger, fear, calculation. Finally, she grabbed her bag and pushed past Margaret, not even bothering to offer some excuse or explanation. "You're crazy," she spat as she stormed down the hallway. "You and that vicious dog both." The front door slammed hard enough to rattle the windows. Margaret stood there for a long moment, adrenaline making her shake. Then her legs gave out, and she would have fallen if Max hadn't been right there, solid and steady, letting her lean on him as she lowered herself to sit on the bed. She buried her good hand in his fur, feeling the warm strength of him. "Good boy," she whispered. "Such a good boy." Max licked her cheek, then rested his head on her lap, his tail wagging slowly. Margaret's phone rang again. Karen, persistent as always. This time Margaret answered. "Mom? I've been trying to reach you. Are you okay?" Margaret looked at the jewelry scattered on her floor, at her faithful dog pressed against her side, at the open doorway where a person she trusted had just betrayed her. "I'm okay," she said, "but we need to talk." The aftermath of Brenda's attempted theft left Margaret shaken in ways she hadn't expected. It wasn't just the violation of trust, though that stung badly enough. It was the realization of how vulnerable she was, how easily someone could take advantage of her in her weakened state. That night, after Karen had called the police and Riverside Home Health Services, after the questions and the statements and the assurances that Brenda would be fired immediately, Margaret sat alone in her living room with Max at her feet and cried. She cried for her independence that was slipping away, for the body that no longer obeyed her commands, for having to rely on strangers who might hurt her, for being the kind of person who needed protecting instead of the kind who could protect herself. Max whined softly and pressed his nose against her knee, his brown eyes full of concern that was almost human. "What would I have done without you?" she whispered, running her fingers through his thick fur. She would have gotten away with it. The police officer who'd taken her statement, a young woman named Officer Chun, no relation to her neighbor, apparently, had been sympathetic but realistic. "Without proof, it's your word against hers," Officer Chun had explained gently. "She'll claim she was just retrieving your phone like she said, that the jewelry box fell accidentally, that your dog attacked her unprovoked. But Max has never. I believe you, Mrs. Sullivan. I really do. But believing and proving are different things. The best we can do is file a report, make sure she doesn't work in home care anymore, and warn other potential victims." It had felt inadequate, unsatisfying. Brenda would face consequences, yes, but not real justice. She'd just move on to another vulnerable person, another opportunity. That's when Karen had mentioned the cameras. "Mom," Karen had said over the phone, her voice careful in that way that meant she was about to suggest something Margaret wouldn't like. "The cameras I installed. They've been recording everything." Margaret's stomach had dropped. "Everything. Everything in the common areas, yes. Including your bedroom doorway, where the camera in the hallway would have caught. Karen paused. Mom, we have video of what happened. Actual proof. Margaret didn't know whether to feel relieved or violated. The cameras she'd reluctantly agreed to, the surveillance she'd resented, had just become her salvation. Can you send it to the police? Margaret asked quietly. Already done. I called Officer Chen back. Mom, this changes everything. They can actually prosecute her now. The video, Margaret learned later, told a damning story. It showed Brenda helping Margaret into the bathroom, all smiles and professional care. Then it showed Brenda's face changing the moment she was alone in the bedroom, her expression shifting from pleasant to cold and calculating. The footage caught her going straight to Margaret's jewelry box, not even glancing at the phone that was supposedly her mission. It showed her opening the box with practiced ease, starting to sort through the contents, clearly evaluating what was worth taking. And it showed Max's intervention. Not an attack, but a clear, controlled protective action. He'd grabbed Brenda's arm firmly but hadn't broken skin, hadn't shaken or bitten harder. He'd simply held her in place, stopping her from continuing the theft until Margaret could arrive. That dog's a hero, Officer Chun had said when she came back to show Margaret the footage on her laptop. And this woman is done. We can charge her with attempted theft, possibly elder abuse given the circumstances. And I'll bet once we start digging, we'll find she's done this before. Officer Chun had been right. Within a week, 3 other families had come forward, all elderly clients of Brenda Morrison through various home health agencies. All reported missing jewelry, cash, small valuables, things they'd noticed gone but convinced themselves they'd misplaced in their confusion or memory problems. Things they'd been too embarrassed to report, assuming they were just getting old and forgetful. Brenda had been preying on the vulnerable systematically, carefully selecting victims who were isolated, confused, unlikely to be believed if they did complain. She'd apparently been doing it for years, moving from agency to agency whenever she got too close to being caught, always with just enough clean time and fake references to land the next position. The case made local news. Home health nurse arrested in elder theft ring. Margaret's name was kept private, but the story featured Max prominently, the heroic dog who'd protected his owner. The attention was overwhelming. News crews wanted interviews. Strangers sent cards and letters. Someone even started a GoFundMe to help with Margaret's medical expenses, though she had Medicare and didn't need it. She asked them to donate it to an animal shelter instead. Through it all, Max stayed by her side, seeming to sense that Margaret needed him more than ever. But the incident had left scars deeper than Margaret wanted to admit. She startled at unexpected sounds. She couldn't sleep properly, waking up convinced someone was in the house. And the thought of letting another home health worker into her space made her physically ill. Mom, you still need help, Karen insisted during one of their increasingly tense phone calls. You can't manage alone. I have Max. Max is a dog, not a nurse. You need someone to help you bathe, manage your medications, do physical therapy. I'll figure it out. How? You can barely dress yourself. The words hit like a slap. True, but cruel in their truth. Margaret had ended the call abruptly, too hurt to continue the conversation. Please subscribe to our channel if you're enjoying this story. We share incredible real-life stories every week, and your subscription helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. Click that subscribe button now. Mrs. Chun from next door had become an unexpected ally. She'd started coming over daily just to check in. Sometimes she'd bring soup or tea. Sometimes she'd just sit and chat, giving Margaret a connection to the world outside her increasingly small existence. You know, Mrs. Chun said one afternoon, watching Max follow Margaret from room to room with unwavering vigilance. I read once that dogs can sense bad people. Something about reading body language and micro-expressions that humans miss. You think Max knew? Margaret asked. From the beginning? Dogs know, Mrs. Chun said with certainty. My grandmother always said if a dog doesn't like someone, there's a reason. Dogs see what we're too polite to notice. Margaret thought about those early visits, Max's constant growling, his refusal to let Brendan near her without supervision. She thought he was being overprotective, difficult. Now she realized he'd been trying to warn her all along. I should have listened to him, Margaret said softly. You listened when it counted, Mrs. Chun replied. That's what matters. But Margaret couldn't shake the guilt. What if Max had bitten Brenda harder? What if Brenda had managed to claim he was dangerous and had him taken away? What if? The nightmares came frequently now. In them, she was always helpless, always paralyzed, watching as someone, sometimes Brenda, sometimes faceless strangers, ransacked her home while she screamed silently. And Max was always there, always trying to protect her, always ending up hurt because Margaret was too weak to help him. She'd wake gasping, and Max would be right there beside the bed, resting his head on the mattress, his eyes concerned in the darkness. 2 weeks after the incident, Detective Martinez came to visit. He was a stocky man in his 50s with kind eyes and a gentle manner that immediately put Margaret at ease. "Mrs. Sullivan, I wanted to update you personally on the case," he said, accepting the tea she'd managed to prepare with shaking hands. "Brenda Morrison is facing multiple charges across 3 counties. Thanks to your video evidence, we've been able to build a solid case. She'll likely serve real time." "Good," Margaret said firmly. "There's something else," Detective Martinez continued. "In processing her apartment, we found items belonging to at least 15 different victims. Jewelry, medications, even cash hidden in various places. She'd been operating this scheme for close to 7 years. 15 victims. The numbers stagger Margaret. Why? I mean, she had a job. She was working. Gambling debts, the detective explained. She got in deep with some online casinos, then loan sharks when the casinos cut her off. She was stealing to pay them back, then stealing more to cover her living expenses, then stealing more to feed the gambling addiction. Classic spiral. Margaret thought about Brenda's comments about her ex-husband, about how hard it was to make ends meet. Had any of it been true? Or just a performance designed to make her seem sympathetic, trustworthy? The other victims, Margaret asked carefully, did anyone else get hurt? Detective Martinez's expression darkened. Physically? No. But emotionally, financially, yes. There's an 83-year-old widower who's now convinced he has dementia because he couldn't explain where his wife's engagement ring went. A 76-year-old woman who stopped taking her heart medication because Brenda had been selling it and replacing it with placebos. That woman nearly died. The scope of the cruelty took Margaret's breath away. "Your dog may have saved more than just your jewelry, Mrs. Sullivan," the detective said gently. "Your case finally gave us the evidence we needed to stop her. Who knows what would have happened if she'd continued." After Detective Martinez left, Margaret sat with Max on the floor, something she hadn't been able to do since before the stroke. She'd lowered herself down carefully, using furniture for support, and now she was stuck there, but she didn't care. She wrapped both arms around Max's neck, even her weak left arm responding enough for this, and held him close. "You saved me," she whispered into his fur. "You saved so many people." Max's tail thumped against the floor, his body warm and solid and utterly dependable. Later that evening, Karen called with news that was both expected and dreaded. "Mom, I've been doing research, and I think I found a solution. There's a live-in care service that specializes in stroke recovery. They do extensive background checks, bonding, the works, and they allow pets." "Karen, wait, just listen. I know you don't want a stranger in the house, but this is different. It's not just about basic care. It's about actual rehabilitation. Getting your strength back, your independence. Isn't that what you want?" Margaret looked around her living room at the life she'd built, the space that was supposed to be hers. The thought of sharing it with anyone, even someone trustworthy, even someone who could help her, it felt like defeat. But then she looked at Max, whose life had been disrupted by her limitations, who couldn't go on long walks anymore because she couldn't keep up, who spent his days watching her struggle with tasks that should be simple, who'd had to become a guardian instead of just a companion. "Let me think about it," Margaret said finally. "That's all I ask," Karen replied, relief evident in her voice. That night, Margaret watched the hidden camera footage for the first time. Karen had sent her the clips, and though Margaret hadn't wanted to see them, some compulsion drove her to watch. There she was on screen, vulnerable and unaware. There was Brenda, transforming from caregiver to predator the moment she thought no one was watching. And there was Max, magnificent and protective, reading the situation with an instinct Margaret hadn't trusted. She watched the clip 3 times, and each time she saw new details. The way Brenda had moved with practiced efficiency toward the jewelry box. The way she positioned herself to block the doorway's view, not knowing about the camera. The way Max had acted with precision, not violence, holding Brenda just firmly enough to stop her, but not to truly hurt her. He'd been perfect, and Margaret had almost not believed him. The weeks following Brenda's arrest brought an unexpected parade of visitors to Margaret's previously quiet home. First came the reporter from the local paper, an earnest young man who wanted to do a human interest piece about Max. Then a producer from a regional news station, hoping to get Margaret on camera for their feel-good segment. A representative from a German Shepherd Rescue Organization where Robert had originally found Max wanted to use their story for fundraising. Margaret declined most of them. The attention felt intrusive, exploitative even. She hadn't asked to become a cautionary tale about elder abuse or a heartwarming story about a heroic dog. She just wanted her life back, the quiet, independent life she'd had before the stroke, before Brenda, before surveillance cameras made her own home feel like a fishbowl. But she did agree to one interview with a woman named Patricia Holden who ran a local support group for stroke survivors. Patricia was 71 herself, a survivor of 2 strokes, and she approached Margaret not as a story to exploit, but as a peer who understood. "I'm not here to sensationalize what happened to you," Patricia explained over tea in Margaret's living room, Max lying protectively between them. "I'm here because your experience highlights something that happens to vulnerable people every day, and nobody talks about it. The home care industry has wonderful, dedicated professionals, but it also has predators, and the people most at risk are the ones least able to protect themselves." Margaret studied Patricia's face, seeing genuine concern rather than the gleam of opportunity she'd seen in the others. "What do you want from me?" Margaret asked carefully. "Just to talk. Maybe at one of our group meetings. Let other survivors know they're not alone, that it's okay to trust their instincts, that asking for help doesn't mean giving up their power." Patricia paused. "And maybe to celebrate that magnificent dog of yours, who did what the system should have done, protected you." So Margaret had agreed. And the following Tuesday, she found herself in a church basement with 12 other stroke survivors, all of them at various stages of recovery, all of them carrying similar stories of vulnerability and fear and the struggle to maintain dignity while needing help. There was Tom, 79, who'd fired 3 different home health aides before finding one he trusted. There was Lakeisha, 62, whose family had moved her into a nursing home against her will because they deemed her unable to make her own decisions. There was Harold, 85, who lived in terror that his children would discover he'd hired help because they'd use it as evidence he couldn't live alone anymore. Margaret told her story, not the dramatic version the reporters had wanted, but the real one. The fear, the shame of needing help, the violation of having someone betray that trust. And Max's intervention, which she now understood hadn't just been about protecting her possessions, but about protecting her. "Dogs don't care about jewelry," an older man named Frank observed. "Your Max wasn't protecting your things. He was protecting you from someone who meant you harm. There's a difference." The group had nodded in agreement, and Margaret felt something shift inside her. Frank was right. Max hadn't attacked Brenda for stealing. He'd stopped her from victimizing Margaret. It was about the person, not the possessions. After the meeting, several people approached Margaret privately. They shared their own stories of abuse, neglect, theft, all from people who were supposed to be caregivers. Most had never reported it, too embarrassed or afraid, or convinced nothing would be done anyway. "You did something," a tiny woman named Ruth told Margaret, gripping her hand with surprising strength. "You stood up. You let people know. That matters more than you realize." If this story is resonating with you, please hit that subscribe button. We're building a community of people who care about these important issues, and every subscription helps us reach more people with stories that matter. Subscribe now and turn on notifications. The criminal case against Brenda Morrison moved forward with surprising speed. The district attorney, apparently motivated by the public attention and the clear evidence, pushed for a trial date within 4 months. Detective Martinez kept Margaret updated on the progress, and what he shared was both satisfying and disturbing. Brenda's pattern had been methodical. She'd target elderly clients who lived alone, preferably those with some cognitive impairment or isolation from family. She'd start small, taking cash from a wallet, pocketing a pill or two from medication bottles. Then she'd escalate to jewelry, small electronics, anything that could be easily sold or pawned. She'd always have excuses ready. The patient must have misplaced it, must have forgotten they gave it away, must be confused. And it had worked until Max. The thing is, Detective Martinez explained during one of his updates, if your dog hadn't intervened, and if you hadn't had those cameras, we probably never would have caught her. She was too smart, too careful. She knew exactly who to target and how to cover her tracks. Margaret thought about that often. How many other Brendas were out there? How many vulnerable people were being exploited right now, too scared or confused to speak up? Meanwhile, Karen had been persistent about the live-in care option. She'd sent Margaret brochures, websites, testimonials from satisfied families. The service she'd found, Evergreen Home Companions, did seem different from typical home health agencies. They employed caregivers who were extensively vetted, trained not just in medical care, but in companionship and emotional support. They emphasized building genuine relationships with clients rather than just providing services. They even do trial periods, Karen explained, during one of their increasingly frequent video calls. A caregiver would come for a month. If it doesn't work out, if you're not comfortable, they'll match you with someone else. No pressure, no commitment until you're sure. Margaret wanted to say no outright, but something was changing in her thinking. Maybe it was the support group, seeing how other survivors balanced independence with accepting help. Maybe it was the realization that her fear of needing help was actually limiting her, that with proper support, she might regain some of the function she'd lost, might be able to do more, be more. Or maybe it was Max. She noticed he'd been limping slightly on his back left leg. Nothing severe, but enough to make her worry. He was getting older, 8.5 now, which was middle age for a German Shepherd. He'd spent months compensating for her limitations, staying constantly alert, never fully relaxing. It wasn't fair to him. Okay, Margaret heard herself say, surprising herself as much as Karen. 1-month trial, but they have to be okay with Max. The silence on the other end of the video call stretched so long that Margaret thought the connection had frozen. Then Karen's face broke into a smile so bright it made Margaret's chest hurt. Really? Mom, really? Really? But I have conditions. Whatever you need, Mom. Whatever makes you comfortable. Margaret's conditions were specific. The caregiver had to meet Max before the trial started. If Max didn't approve, it was a non-starter. They had to agree to Margaret's routines, not impose their own. They had to understand this was Margaret's home, not theirs. And they had to be willing to focus on rehabilitation, on helping Margaret regain her independence, not on making her more dependent. Karen agreed to everything immediately, with an enthusiasm that made Margaret both grateful and slightly suspicious. Was she really that worried? Had Margaret's condition been worse than she realized? The caregiver who arrived for the interview 2 weeks later was not what Margaret had expected. His name was Daniel Chun. Yes, related to Mrs. Chun next door, her grandson actually, and he was 28 years old, tall and fit, with an easy smile and gentle manner. Margaret had been expecting someone older, more matronly perhaps. A young man hadn't even been on her radar. Mrs. Sullivan, Daniel said, extending his hand respectfully. It's good to meet you. My grandmother speaks very highly of you. Margaret found herself shaking his hand, noting the firm but not crushing grip, the genuine warmth in his eyes. Your grandmother has been a good neighbor, Margaret said carefully. But I'm not sure about this. You're very young. I'm a licensed physical therapist and certified nursing assistant, Daniel explained without defensiveness. I've been doing in-home care for 6 years, specializing in stroke recovery. I'm young, but I'm not inexperienced. Then Max approached, and Margaret held her breath. This was the real test. Max sniffed Daniel carefully, circling him slowly, his tail neither wagging nor tucked. Daniel stood still, letting Max complete his inspection without trying to pet him or win him over with false enthusiasm. "He's a beautiful dog," Daniel said quietly, not looking at Max, but keeping his body language open and non-threatening. "My grandmother told me what he did. That takes incredible intelligence and control." Max completed his circuit, then sat directly in front of Daniel and offered his paw. Margaret nearly cried. It was Robert's trick. Robert had taught Max to shake hands as a greeting. Max only did it with people he truly liked. Daniel carefully shook Max's paw, his expression respectful. "Pleased to meet you too, buddy." The trial period was supposed to start the following Monday, but Margaret found herself agreeing to let Daniel come for short visits beforehand. Just an hour or two, getting to know the house, the routines, each other. It felt less overwhelming that way, less like surrendering her space all at once. Daniel had an easy way about him that Margaret appreciated. He didn't treat her like a child or an invalid. He asked her questions about her preferences, her goals, what frustrated her most about her current limitations. He listened to her answers and took notes, actually wrote things down as if her opinions mattered. "Your main complaint is the left arm," Daniel observed during their second meeting. "It's frustrating because your leg has regained most of its function, but the arm is lagging." "I can barely use it," Margaret admitted. "I can't cook properly, can't clean, can't even brush my own hair right." "Can I see your range of motion?" Daniel asked. Margaret demonstrated, lifting her left arm with effort, managing to get it about halfway up before it refused to go further. The muscles trembled with the strain. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "Okay, here's what I'm seeing. You got about 50% range of motion, but you're babying it because movement causes discomfort. The more you baby it, the more it atrophies. It's a cycle." "So what do I do?" Margaret asked, hearing the desperation in her own voice. "We break the cycle. Gentle, consistent therapy. Building strength gradually. It's going to be uncomfortable sometimes, but not painful. There's a difference." Daniel smiled. "And I think Max can help with that too." Max. Dogs are excellent therapy partners. The routine of caring for him, brushing, feeding, walking, those are all therapeutic activities. We just need to adapt them to work with your current abilities and build from there. It was the first time anyone had suggested that caring for Max could be part of her recovery, rather than a burden she shouldn't be managing. The idea sparked something hopeful in Margaret's chest. By the time Daniel left that afternoon, Margaret found herself actually looking forward to Monday rather than dreading it. Mrs. Chun came by later that evening, ostensibly to bring Margaret some homemade dumplings, but really, Margaret suspected, to check on how the meeting with her grandson had gone. "He seems very competent," Margaret said carefully, accepting the still warm container. Mrs. Chin's eyes twinkled. "Daniel is a good boy, very patient. He took care of his grandfather after his stroke. That's what made him want to become a physical therapist." "I didn't know that. He doesn't talk about it much. But he understands what you're going through, Margaret. Not just professionally, but personally. He knows what it's like to watch someone you love struggle, to want to help without taking away their dignity." Margaret thought about that after Mrs. Chen left. Daniel's calm demeanor, his respectful questions, his willingness to let Max set the pace of their introduction. It all made more sense now. He'd been where she was, or at least close enough to understand. The weekend passed slowly. Margaret found herself anxious about Monday, second-guessing her decision. What if it didn't work out? What if having someone in her space constantly was unbearable? What if she just opened her home to another predator? But then she'd look at Max, remember his instinct about Brenda, and feel reassured. Max had approved of Daniel immediately. That had to mean something. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching Margaret's nervous mood. Daniel arrived at 8 a.m. sharp, carrying a professional-looking bag and wearing comfortable clothes that suggested he was ready to work. "Morning, Mrs. Sullivan," he said cheerfully. "Ready to get started?" "I suppose so," Margaret replied, then caught herself. Yes. Yes, let's do this." Daniel's smile suggested he understood her hesitation perfectly. The first few days were an adjustment. Daniel moved through Margaret's space with practiced efficiency, preparing breakfast, organizing her medications, helping her with morning hygiene routines that had become frustratingly difficult. But he did it all while maintaining conversation, asking her opinion, letting her make choices. Do you want oatmeal or eggs this morning? Which sweater do you prefer, the blue or the green? Max needs a walk. Want to come along, even just to the end of the driveway. Small choices, but they mattered. They reminded Margaret that this was still her life, her home, her routine. Daniel was there to assist, not to take over. The physical therapy sessions were harder. Daniel started gentle, but even gentle exercises made Margaret's weak left arm scream in protest. She'd grit her teeth, fighting back tears of frustration as her arm trembled and failed to perform simple movements. I can't, she'd gasp after 15 minutes of attempting to lift a small weight. You did, Daniel would correct gently. You just did 15 minutes. Yesterday, you could only do 10. That's progress, Mrs. Sullivan. Call me Margaret, she'd said after the third day of Mrs. Sullivan. If you're going to see me at my worst, you might as well use my first name. Daniel's smile had been warm. Margaret it is. And I'm Daniel, not Mr. Chun or Sir or anything formal. Deal. Max seemed to sense that Daniel was helping, not threatening. He'd watched the therapy sessions with interest, sometimes bringing Daniel a toy as if to say, I'm here too, but never interfering. At night, Max still slept by Margaret's bed, but he'd stopped the hyper-vigilant behavior he'd shown during Brenda's visits. He relaxed, which allowed Margaret to relax too. By the end of the first week, Margaret had to admit things were better. The house was cleaner. Meals were more nutritious and regular. Her medications were organized properly. And most importantly, she was doing more, not less, because Daniel pushed her gently but consistently to attempt things she'd given up on. I want you to try brushing Max today, Daniel said on day 8. Margaret looked at the brush, then at her weak left hand. I can't hold the brush steady, so use your right hand and stabilize Max with your left. You don't have to grip, just place your left hand on him for balance. It seemed impossible, but with Daniel holding Max steady and encouraging her, Margaret managed it. 10 strokes, then 15, then 20. Max's tail wagged contentedly, and Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. Tears of accomplishment this time, not frustration. See? Daniel said softly, you're stronger than you think. The trial month was halfway through when Margaret got a call from the district attorney's office. Brenda Morrison had accepted a plea deal, 5 years in prison followed by 5 years probation. She'd also agreed to pay restitution to all her victims, though the DA's assistant admitted that since Brenda had no assets, the restitution would likely never materialize. 5 years seems light, Margaret said, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. It is, the assistant DA agreed. But it was this or risk a trial that might result in her walking free. At least this way she's definitely off the streets, definitely can't work in home health care again, and she has a felony record that will follow her forever. It wasn't the justice Margaret wanted, but she supposed it was the justice that was possible. She thanked the assistant DA and hung up, feeling oddly deflated. Daniel found her sitting by the window, staring out at nothing. Bad news? He asked, settling into the chair across from her, with 2 cups of tea. Margaret explained about the plea deal, about the inadequate sentence for so much harm caused. Daniel listened quietly, then said, My grandfather used to say that justice and vengeance are different things. Justice is about making things right for the future. Vengeance is about punishing the past. You got justice. She can't hurt anyone else now. Vengeance wouldn't have changed what happened to you. Very philosophical, Margaret said, but she was smiling slightly. I contain multitudes, Daniel replied with mock seriousness, making her laugh outright. That evening, Karen video called for her nightly check-in. Margaret noticed she looked less worried than usual. The tension around her eyes eased. Mom, you look good, Karen said, and she sounded surprised. Really good. Your color is better. Daniel's been making me eat vegetables. Margaret grumbled, but without real complaint. And how's that going? The arrangement with Daniel? Margaret glanced over to where Daniel was in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner with Max, supervising hopefully for dropped food. She could hear him talking to Max, something about no more treats, buddy. Your mom says you're getting chunky. It's going well, Margaret admitted. Better than I expected. So you'll keep him on? After the trial month. Margaret hadn't let herself think that far ahead, afraid to hope it could continue. But hearing Karen ask the question made her realize she wanted it to continue. Daniel had become part of the routine, the household. He'd earned Max's trust and, harder still, her own. Yes, Margaret said. I'd like him to stay. Karen's smile was brilliant. I'm so glad, Mom. You sound happier. Stronger. I'm stronger, Margaret said, flexing her left arm slightly, a gesture that would have been impossible a month ago. Daniel's a good therapist and a good person. After the call ended, Margaret sat for a moment reflecting on how much had changed. 6 months ago, she'd been fiercely independent, refusing all help. 3 months ago, she'd been betrayed and terrified. And now she was allowing someone into her life, accepting help, and somehow feeling more independent because of it rather than less. It was a paradox she was still trying to understand. The transition from trial period to permanent arrangement happened seamlessly. Daniel simply stayed, and Margaret simply let him, and neither of them made a big production of it. Karen sent an official contract from Evergreen Home Companions, which Margaret signed after reading it thoroughly. She wasn't making the mistake of blind trust again, even with someone as trustworthy as Daniel seemed to be. The contract was fair. Daniel would live in Margaret's guest room, provide care and physical therapy services, maintain the household, and receive a salary plus room and board. Margaret retained complete autonomy over her space, her decisions, her life. If either party wanted to terminate the arrangement, they needed to give 2 weeks' notice. It was professional, clear, and somehow reassuring in its formality. Welcome aboard permanently, Margaret said when she handed Daniel the signed contract. Happy to be here, Daniel replied with that easy smile of his. Now, ready for your therapy session? I want to try something new today. The something new turned out to be cooking therapy. Daniel had Margaret help prepare lunch, using the repetitive motions of chopping vegetables and stirring pots to work her left arm's fine motor control. This is sneaky, Margaret observed as she struggled to grip a wooden spoon steady enough to stir soup. You're making me do therapy by making me work. Multitasking, Daniel said cheerfully. Plus you get to eat the results, which is better motivation than lifting weights. Max lay on the kitchen floor, watching the proceedings with interest, occasionally getting up to investigate if anything edible had hit the ground. Margaret noticed he seemed happier too, more playful. The constant vigilance he'd maintained after the stroke, and especially after Brenda had eased. He was just a dog again, not a guardian on eternal duty. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We're sharing these powerful stories to raise awareness about elder care issues and celebrate the amazing bonds between people and their pets. Hit that subscribe button and the bell icon so you never miss a story. Life settled into a comfortable routine. Mornings were for therapy, sometimes physical exercises, sometimes occupational therapy like cooking or folding laundry or other daily tasks Margaret needed to relearn. Afternoons were for rest, reading, or visits from Mrs. Chun and occasionally other members of the stroke survivor support group that Margaret had continued attending. Evenings were for dinner, television, and the simple pleasure of not being alone. Daniel turned out to be excellent company. He was well-read, curious about the world, and had a dry sense of humor that matched Margaret's own. They'd watch Jeopardy together, shouting out answers, keeping score of who got more right. Margaret usually won. Decades of watching the show had given her an encyclopedic knowledge of random facts. But Daniel gave her genuine competition. How do you know so much about 18th century French literature? Margaret demanded one evening after Daniel correctly answered an obscure question about Voltaire. College, Daniel said with a shrug. I was a comparative literature major before I switched to physical therapy. You were a literature major? For 2 years. Then my grandfather had his stroke, and I realized I wanted to do something more practical, more hands-on, but I still love reading. It explained the books Margaret had noticed appearing around the house. Classic novels, poetry collections, contemporary literary fiction. Daniel was working his way through her bookshelves, borrowing volumes and returning them with careful respect for their condition. You can keep any you want, Margaret told him. Most of them were Robert's, and he'd have liked knowing they were being read. Your husband? Daniel asked gently. It was the first time he'd really asked about Robert. 47 years, Margaret said. He died 3 years ago. Cancer. I'm sorry. So am I. Margaret looked at Max, dozing by the fireplace. Robert gave me Max, right before the end. He knew I'd need someone, and he knew I wouldn't accept a human companion easily. But a dog. I couldn't say no to a dog. Wise man. He was. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of silence that only happens between people who've grown at ease with each other. Then Daniel spoke again, his voice thoughtful. Can I ask you something? About what happened with Brenda. Margaret tensed slightly. She didn't like thinking about Brenda, though the nightmares had finally started to fade. What about it? Max knew, Daniel said. From the beginning, he knew she was dangerous. But you didn't believe him at first. Why? It was a fair question, one Margaret had asked herself many times. Because I'm human, she said finally. Humans are taught to ignore instinct, to be polite, to give people the benefit of the doubt. Max didn't have those constraints. He just knew, and he acted on what he knew. Do you trust your instincts now? Daniel asked. After everything? Margaret looked at him, really looked at him, at his open, honest face, at Max sleeping peacefully in his presence, at the way Daniel had integrated into her life so smoothly, so respectfully. Yes, she said, I trust my instincts, and my instincts say you're one of the good ones. Daniel's smile was soft, touched. That means a lot. Thank you. The months passed. Summer faded into fall, then winter. Margaret's progress was steady, if not dramatic. Her left arm regained more function. She could grip properly now, could hold things for extended periods, could even manage buttons and zippers most days. Her stamina improved. She could walk around the block with Max and Daniel, could stand long enough to prepare simple meals, could manage most of her self-care independently. She'd never be the same as before the stroke. That old Margaret was gone, and grieving her was pointless. But this new Margaret was stronger than she'd thought possible 6 months ago. She was adapting, overcoming, surviving. The stroke survivor support group noticed. Patricia, who ran the group, asked Margaret to speak again, this time about recovery and accepting help. I was terrified of losing my independence, Margaret told the group. I thought accepting help meant admitting defeat. But I learned that real independence isn't doing everything yourself. It's having the strength to accept help so you can do more, be more. She talked about Daniel, about how having professional support had actually made her more independent rather than less. About how therapy had given her back capabilities she'd thought were gone forever. About how trust, once broken by Brenda, could be rebuilt with the right person. And she talked about Max, about listening to instincts, about how animals sometimes know things humans are too civilized to see. The response was overwhelming. 3 people approached her afterward, asking for recommendations for caregivers. 2 others shared their own stories of abuse by home health workers, emboldened by Margaret's openness about her experience. You're making a difference, Patricia told Margaret as they were leaving. People need to hear these stories. They need to know they're not alone. Margaret hadn't set out to be anyone's inspiration or cautionary tale. But if her experience could help others avoid what she'd gone through, or give them courage to report abuse, then maybe there was purpose in the pain. Christmas approached. Karen asked if Margaret wanted to come to Boston for the holidays, but Margaret declined. She didn't feel up to traveling, and besides, this was her home. Karen decided to come to Connecticut instead, bringing her partner, Michael, whom Margaret had only met a handful of times. Is it okay if Daniel stays for Christmas? Karen asked during one of their planning calls. I mean, is that weird? Should we give him time off? Margaret hadn't even considered asking Daniel to leave. The house was his home too now. He stays, she said firmly. He's family. The word surprised her as she said it, but it was true. Somewhere in the past months, Daniel had transitioned from employee to something more. Not quite family by blood, but family by choice and circumstance. Daniel seemed touched when she told him he was expected to stay for Christmas. Are you sure? I don't want to intrude on family time. You're not intruding, Margaret assured him. Besides, Max would be devastated if you left. As if understanding his name, Max thumped his tail and pushed his head under Daniel's hand for petting. Well, if Max insists, Daniel said with mock seriousness. Christmas Eve arrived cold and clear. Karen and Michael came bearing gifts and groceries and enough worried energy to fill the house. Karen immediately started fussing over Margaret. Was she eating enough? Sleeping well? Taking her medications properly? Karen breathed. Margaret finally said, "I'm fine. Daniel takes excellent care of me. Stop hovering." "I'm not hovering. I'm concerned." "You're hovering." Michael, a quiet man with kind eyes who worked as an accountant, smiled at the exchange. "She hovers over me too," he confided to Margaret. "It's how she shows love." Daniel and Michael hit it off immediately, bonding over books and cooking. They took over the kitchen to prepare Christmas dinner while Margaret and Karen sat in the living room with Max sprawled between them. "He really is good," Karen said quietly, watching Daniel laugh at something Michael had said. "Daniel, he's been good for you, Mom." "He has," Margaret agreed. "And you're really doing better? Not just saying that to make me feel less guilty about not being here." Margaret turned to face her daughter fully. "Karen, listen to me. Yes, I'm really doing better. And you don't need to feel guilty. You have your own life in Boston, your own career, Michael. I don't expect you to put your life on hold for me. But you're my mom. When you had the stroke, when that woman," Karen's voice caught, "I should have been here. I should have protected you." "You did protect me," Margaret said gently. "You insisted on the cameras, remember? If you hadn't done that, we never would have caught Brenda. You protected me even from hundreds of miles away." Karen wiped her eyes, managing a watery smile. "I guess I did. You did. And you found Daniel, who's given me my life back. You've been exactly the daughter I needed you to be." They hugged, carefully given Margaret's still limited left side mobility, and both of them cried a little. Max, sensing emotions, pushed his head onto both their laps simultaneously, making them laugh through the tears. Christmas dinner was chaotic and perfect. Daniel and Michael had outdone themselves with the cooking. Roasted turkey, mashed potatoes, 3 kinds of vegetables, homemade rolls. The table was crowded, the conversation flowing, and for the first time since Robert's death, Margaret's house felt full of life again. They told stories, shared memories. Karen talked about her work at the nonprofit she directed. Michael shared funny anecdotes about his more eccentric accounting clients. Daniel told them about his grandfather, about learning to care for someone you love who's losing capabilities, about how it taught him patience and empathy. And Margaret talked about Robert, about their life together, about Max. It didn't hurt as much as it used to, talking about Robert. The grief had softened into something more like sweet nostalgia. After dinner, they watched old Christmas movies and ate too many cookies. Max positioned himself strategically to intercept any dropped food, his tail wagging optimistically. And Margaret looked around her living room, at her daughter and Michael cuddled on the couch, at Daniel teaching Max a new trick at the twinkling lights on the tree, and felt something she hadn't felt in months. Contentment. Pure, simple contentment. Later, after Karen and Michael had gone to bed in Margaret's room, while Margaret took the guest room, after Daniel had cleaned up the kitchen and retired to the spare room, Margaret lay in the unfamiliar bed with Max on the floor beside her and took stock of her life. A year ago, she'd been healthy and independent and alone. 6 months ago, she'd been terrified and vulnerable and betrayed. Now she was disabled but recovering, dependent but growing stronger, and surrounded by people who genuinely cared about her well-being. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was a good life nonetheless. "Thank you," she whispered to Max in the darkness, "for protecting me, for knowing what I couldn't see, for being exactly what I needed." Max's tail thumped against the floor, and Margaret smiled. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new therapy sessions, new small victories and frustrations. But tonight, everything was perfect. The new year brought unexpected changes. In January, Detective Martinez called with news that Brenda Morrison had been sentenced and was officially in state custody. But he also had other news. The case had sparked a broader investigation into oversight in the home healthcare industry in Connecticut. "Your case was the catalyst," Detective Martinez explained. The state's looking at implementing stricter background checks, mandatory bonding for home health workers, and a registry system, so agencies can't just hire someone who was fired elsewhere without knowing why. That's good, Margaret said, though part of her wondered why it took her experience to make these changes. How many people had suffered before her because these protections didn't exist? There's something else, the detective continued. The victims' advocacy group wants to know if you'd be willing to testify at some legislative hearings. They're pushing for Margaret's Law. That's what they're calling it. Comprehensive home health care reform. Margaret's Law, her name attached to legislation. The idea was both flattering and overwhelming. I need to think about it, she told Detective Martinez. She discussed it that evening with Daniel over dinner. What do you think? She asked. Is this something I should do? Daniel considered carefully before answering. I think it depends on why you do it. If you feel obligated, well, like you'd be letting people down by saying no, then don't do it. But if you genuinely believe you can make a difference, that your testimony could help protect other people, then maybe it's worth the discomfort. It would be uncomfortable, Margaret said. Testifying, reliving what happened, being in the public eye. Very uncomfortable, Daniel agreed. But you've done uncomfortable things before. You survived a stroke. You rebuilt your strength. You trusted again after being betrayed. Compared to all that, testifying is just talking. Margaret smiled at the simplification. Just talking. Just talking that could change laws and protect vulnerable people, Daniel amended. No pressure, though. But there was pressure, internal pressure. Margaret thought about the support group, about the stories she'd heard of abuse and exploitation. She thought about the 15 victims whose stolen belongings had been found in Brenda's apartment. She thought about all the people currently being victimized who had no Max to protect them, no cameras to provide evidence, no voice to speak up. She called Detective Martinez back the next morning. I'll testify. The legislative hearing was scheduled for late February. In the weeks leading up to it, Margaret worked with a victim's advocate named Sarah Chun, another Chun, though she assured Margaret there was no relation to the grandmother-grandson duo Margaret knew. Sarah helped Margaret prepare her testimony, organizing her thoughts, anticipating difficult questions. They'll ask about Max attacking Brenda, Sarah warned. The opposition will try to paint your dog as dangerous, argue that the real problem was having an aggressive animal unsupervised with a healthcare worker. Max didn't attack her, Margaret said firmly. He restrained her. There's a difference. I know that, and you know that. But they'll twist it if they can. Be prepared. Margaret also heard from other victims who'd be testifying. Some had experienced theft like she had. Others had suffered worse. Physical abuse, medication tampering, financial exploitation. One woman, elderly and frail, had been pushed downstairs by her caregiver, who'd then claimed the woman had fallen on her own. Only a neighbor's doorbell camera had captured the truth. The scope of the problem was staggering, and Margaret realized her experience, traumatic as it had been, was relatively minor compared to what others had endured. Please subscribe to our channel if you're moved by Margaret's story. We're committed to sharing important stories that raise awareness about elder care, abuse prevention, and the incredible bonds between humans and their animal companions. Your subscription helps us reach more people with these vital messages. Subscribe now. The night before the hearing, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay in bed rehearsing her testimony, worrying about saying the wrong thing, failing to convey the importance of these reforms. Max sensed her anxiety and jumped onto the bed, something he rarely did, curling up against her side in a warm, solid mass of comfort. Tomorrow's a big day, huh, buddy? Margaret whispered, running her hand through his fur. We're going to tell them what you did. How you saved me. Max sighed contentedly, as if to say, just doing my job. The legislative hearing took place in Hartford, in one of those imposing government buildings with marble floors and echoing hallways. Karen had driven down to be there, as had Mrs. Chun and several members of the support group. Daniel stayed home with Max. Dogs weren't allowed in the building, which seemed unfair given that Max was the hero of the story. Margaret sat in the witness area with other survivors, all of them nervous, all of them determined. The legislators sat in tiered rows above them, some looking genuinely interested, others checking their phones, a few clearly just going through the motions. Margaret was the third person called to testify. She approached the microphone on shaking legs, her cane clicking against the marble floor, and looked out at the assembly. Then she began to speak. She told them about her stroke, about her reluctance to accept help, about finally agreeing to home health care. She described Brenda Morrison's perfect facade, the references that checked out, the professional demeanor that hid a predator's intent. She explained how Max had known from the beginning, how his warnings had been dismissed, how his intervention had ultimately saved her. "My dog saw what I couldn't," Margaret said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "He recognized a threat I was too trusting, too desperate for help to see. But I'm one of the lucky ones. I had Max. I had cameras installed by my daughter. I had evidence. Most victims don't have those things. They have only their word against someone who's learned how to appear trustworthy, who knows exactly how to exploit vulnerable people." She detailed the aftermath, the discovery of 15 other victims, the plea bargain that seemed inadequate, the realization that better systems could have prevented all of it. "The reforms proposed in this legislation aren't radical," Margaret concluded. "They're common sense. Background checks that actually check criminal history across state lines. A registry, so agencies know if someone was fired for cause. Mandatory reporting requirements. Surprise inspections. These things could save lives, prevent abuse, give vulnerable people the protection they deserve." The questions that followed were sometimes sympathetic, sometimes skeptical. One legislator did indeed focus on Max, suggesting that perhaps the real solution was banning large dogs from homes with healthcare workers. Margaret's response was immediate and firm. "My dog didn't create the danger. He responded to it. Banning protection is not the same as preventing abuse. And frankly, sir, if I had to choose between Max and a stranger in my home, I'd choose Max every single time." A ripple of applause went through the gallery, quickly silenced by the committee chair. Another legislator asked about the cost of implementing these reforms, suggesting they might be too expensive for smaller home health agencies. "What's the cost of not implementing them?" Margaret replied. "What's the cost to victims? What's the cost to families? What's the cost to society when we allow vulnerable people to be preyed upon because oversight is too expensive?" By the time Margaret finished testifying, she was exhausted but also exhilarated. She'd said what needed saying. Whether it made a difference remained to be seen. Karen hugged her tightly as Margaret left the witness stand. "You were amazing, Mom. So strong." "I was terrified," Margaret admitted. "Strong and terrified aren't mutually exclusive," Mrs. Chun observed wisely. The hearing continued for hours, with more witnesses, expert testimony from healthcare professionals, statements from advocacy groups. Margaret stayed to hear it all, wanting to honor the others who'd found the courage to speak up. By the time they left the building, it was dark outside. Karen drove Margaret home, both of them too emotionally drained from much conversation. But as they pulled into Margaret's driveway, Karen said softly, "Dad would have been proud of you today." Margaret's throat tightened. "You think so? I know so. You took something terrible and used it to protect other people." That's who he was too. Always trying to make things better, safer, more fair. When Margaret walked in the door, Max greeted her with his usual enthusiasm, tail wagging, whole body wiggling with joy. Daniel had prepared dinner, comfort food, Margaret's favorites. "How did it go?" Daniel asked, helping Margaret out of her coat. "I think it went well," Margaret said. "I guess we'll find out." The legislation, officially titled An Act Concerning Home Healthcare Worker Oversight and Protection of Vulnerable Adults, but commonly referred to as Margaret's Law, passed a committee on a bipartisan vote. It moved to the full legislature in March, where debate was heated but ultimately successful. By April, the governor had signed it into law. Margaret watched the signing ceremony on television, seeing her own face in the background of news footage, hearing reporters mention her case as the catalyst for reform. It felt surreal, like she was watching something happen to someone else. But the impact was real. Agencies now had to conduct thorough background checks. A central registry tracked healthcare workers across the state. Surprise inspections became mandatory, and victims were given clear reporting mechanisms with guaranteed follow-up. It wouldn't prevent all abuse. No law could do that. But it would make abuse harder to perpetrate and easier to catch. That was something. Life returned to a new normal. Margaret's therapy continued, her progress plateauing at a level that was livable if not perfect. She had about 75% function in her left arm now, could walk without a cane on good days, could manage most daily activities independently. She'd never be the person she was before the stroke, but she'd become someone new, someone stronger in ways that had nothing to do with physical capability. Her relationship with Daniel evolved too. He was still her caregiver officially, but they'd become genuine friends. They developed inside jokes, shared routines, comfortable silences. He still did therapy sessions with her, still helped with tasks that remained difficult, but increasingly he was just there, a companion, a presence that made the house feel less empty. Karen visited more often, sometimes with Michael, sometimes alone. The worry in her voice during phone calls had eased. She'd stopped trying to convince Margaret to move to Boston, recognizing that her mother had built a life here that worked. And Max was simply Max. He got a little grayer around the muzzle, moved a little slower on cold mornings. But his eyes were still bright, his loyalty absolute. He'd done his job protecting Margaret, and now he could simply be her companion again. One evening in late spring, Margaret sat on her porch watching Max and Daniel play fetch in the yard. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Birds sang in the trees. Neighbors walked by, waving friendly greetings. Mrs. Chun came over with tea, settling into the chair beside Margaret with a contented sigh. "Beautiful evening," Mrs. Chun observed. "It is," Margaret agreed. They sat in comfortable silence, two elderly women who'd become friends through circumstance and proximity. Finally, Mrs. Chun spoke again. "You know, when you first came home from the hospital after the stroke, I worried about you. You seemed so lost, so angry at the world." Margaret admitted. "I felt like everything had been taken from me. And now," Margaret thought about it, really thought about it. "Now I know that things were taken, yes, but other things were gained. Perspective, compassion, the ability to ask for help, appreciation for what I have instead of mourning what I've lost. Wisdom," Mrs. Chun said with a smile. "That's what they call that. Wisdom earned the hard way," Margaret replied. "Is there any other kind?" They laughed together, two survivors who understood that life's difficulties either break you or forge you into something stronger. Margaret had chosen to be forged. As darkness fell and Daniel called Max inside, as Margaret prepared to end another day in the life she'd rebuilt, she reflected on the journey from that terrible moment on the grass when her body had betrayed her through the violation of Brenda's exploitation, to this moment of peace on her porch. It hadn't been easy. There had been pain, fear, humiliation, rage. There had been moments she'd wanted to give up, to surrender to helplessness and bitterness. But Max hadn't let her, and Daniel hadn't let her, and somewhere deep inside, she hadn't let herself. She'd survived. More than that, she'd transformed survival into something meaningful, testimony that changed laws, a story that helped others, a life that proved disability didn't mean defeat. "Ready to head in?" Daniel asked from the doorway, Max panting happily at his side. "Ready," Margaret said, rising from her chair with only slight effort, her balance steady, her strength sufficient. As she walked into her warm, well-lit home with her dog at her side and her friend holding the door, Margaret realized something profound. She was more than okay. She was exactly where she needed to be, exactly who she needed to be. The story that had begun with tragedy and betrayal had become a story of resilience, recovery, and the unexpected grace found in accepting help from both humans and animals who proved worthy of trust. And in the end, that was the most important thing Max had protected. Not her jewelry or her possessions, but her ability to trust again, to hope again, to build a life worth living despite everything that had tried to tear it down. "Good boy, Max," Margaret said softly, scratching behind his ears the way he loved. "Always such a good boy." Max's tail wagged in the darkness, a steady rhythm of contentment that mirrored Margaret's own heart. The house settled into nighttime quiet. Daniel doing his evening routine in his room, Max curling up on his bed by Margaret's door, the familiar creaks and sighs of a home well lived in. Margaret changed into her pajamas slowly but independently, brushed her teeth, took her evening medications from the organizer Daniel had prepared. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror, 78 years old, stroke survivor, abuse survivor, advocate, friend. The face looking back at her was lined and tired, but there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there a year ago. Strength, purpose, peace. Not bad, she told her reflection. Not bad at all. As she climbed into bed, her phone buzzed with a text from Karen. Love you, Mom. Proud of you every single day. Margaret smiled and typed back with her left hand. Still slow, still clumsy, but functional. Love you too, sweetheart. Sleep well. Outside, a gentle rain began to fall, the sound soothing against the windows. Max snored softly from his bed. Somewhere in the house, Daniel was probably reading one of Robert's old books, content in his own space. And Margaret, surrounded by the simple comforts of home and companionship and safety hard-won, closed her eyes and drifted into dreamless, peaceful sleep. The nightmare that had begun with Dog Attack the home nurse had transformed into something unexpected, a story not of victimhood, but of resilience, not of loss, but of finding new ways to thrive. Max hadn't just attacked a home nurse that day. He defended his human, exposed a predator, sparked reform, and reminded everyone who heard the story that sometimes the best protection comes with 4 legs and a loyal heart. And Margaret, who'd once thought her life was ending, had discovered it was actually just beginning a new chapter, one written with courage, supported by love, and guarded faithfully by the best friend she'd ever had. The end. Thank you so much for reading Margaret and Max's story. If this touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories about courage, survival, and the unbreakable bonds between humans and their animal companions. Every subscription helps us share these important messages with more people. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss our next story. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Together, we can raise awareness about elder care issues and celebrate the heroes, both human and canine, who make a difference every single day. Subscribe now, and thank you for being part of our community.